Hi, I'm Keisha, recruiter for AWS's centralized executive assistant recruiting team. Congratulations on making it to the final step of our interview process. You're almost there. I wanted to use this time to get you ready for your interview loop. So here are some things that we're going to cover. We're going to cover the loop interview lineup, as well as talk about the main leadership principles that are typically evaluated on executive assistant loops, with some sample questions that are going to go alongside those. We'll also talk about some loop good to knows when interviewing at Amazon and the Amazon Chime tool that you'll be utilizing during your interview. So starting off with the interview loop lineup, you're going to meet with a variety of people throughout that loop. So hiring manager, that's going to be, a director, a general manager, or vice president that you're supporting. And typical EAs at Amazon are supporting 2 to 3 of those executives. So those people that you're going to be meeting with are going to be one of your hiring managers, if not multiple. We typically like to have 1 to 2 of those hiring managers on your interview loop to ask them questions about, what they're working on, what their work styles are, or particular pain points or in challenges that they may be facing. How they like to partner with their executive assistant are good questions to ask them in their work styles, or maybe an opportunity where an executive assistant can come in and help smooth over a process or implement something. There's also executive assistants that are going to be on that interview loop. So great to ask them a variety of questions around, typical day in life, what that EA community looks like in the org, how they share information and collaborate. An executive assistant's also good to ask questions about onboarding for you and what that's going to look like between having virtual options or potentially some on-site options if you prefer. And challenges that you may face initially coming into the role. You're also going to meet with some business partners that you'll work with and alongside. So some good questions for them are going to learn how they interact with the executive and the team. And as one of the business partners, how do they think an executive assistant can come in and help smooth out processes? You're also going to meet with a person that is more the outsider on the group. So they may not be able to ask questions around typical day in life of an executive assistant. So you want to keep your questions for them more top level, Amazon, AWS kind of questions that they'll help answer. And I always like to call out that this person can also change on your interview loop. So if they do, then we will update you with who it's changing to. But very similar, they're going to be that person that's not going to be able to dive into those EA details. They're there to evaluate for Amazon as a whole, and as it relates to the leadership principles. So going from there is talking about the leadership principles. I definitely hope that you've had a chance to peek at those because they are everything here at Amazon. How we do things, how we orchestrate our processes, and just as important as it is to our culture, it is to our interview process. So each one of your interviewers are actually going to have one of these or a couple of the 16 leadership principles. So again, good knowing those going in and having solid examples around them. We do have 16. I'm going to cover a couple of the ones that are always on executive assistant interview loops. So first we're going to start with have backbone, disagree, and commit. And at Amazon, we look for leaders that are obligated to respectfully challenge decisions even when they disagree. We want people that have different ideas and perspectives and are comfortable bringing it up, even if it isn't the common perspective. And so when you're thinking of have backbone, disagree, and commit, you want to think about how you fight for your ideas and provide that needed data to change and persuade others. Those can come up as questions about how you keep your executive efficient. Sometimes having to push back on the team to ensure that the rhythm of business is still operating smoothly. It can also be about yourself. There's never enough time in the day to get everything done. So sometimes you have to say no or push back and offer another solution for yourself to keep yourself efficient. But when it comes to have backbone, disagree, and commit, the commit part comes in as if you are unsuccessful in persuading your audience, commit and help drive it to success. We want people that are still willing to roll up their sleeves and help drive whatever that idea was to success, even if it's not your own. So, typical question that you get for have backbone, disagree, and commit sounds like, tell me about a time when you and an executive you supported disagreed on something that you thought was important. What was the situation? How did you handle it? How did it impact the relationship moving forward? And could you have done anything differently? And with this question, and honestly, all the questions that you're going to get, your interviewers are going to be looking for specific examples from your experience. So before I answer the disagree and commit question, I wanted to give you an interview tip. So, like I mentioned, all of your interviewers are going to be looking for specific examples from your experience. So before you answer, you want to think about a couple things. You can go through that STAR method, situation, task, action, result. And think about, what was that situation or problem that you are dealing with that you're going to explain to your interviewers? What was that plan or action that you took to solve that problem or create that plan? And how did it turn out? Did it work out? Were people happy? Did you get feedback? Did it not work out? And the next time you put something into place and it did. And then you also want to, at the end of the STAR, I always say throw another R on there for the reflect questions that are going to come your way. And those are going to be more of those follow-up questions that sound like, what would you have done differently reflecting on it now? How could your process, evolve or what would you have changed now knowing the results? And I like to call this out just because you're going to get these reflect questions and follow-up questions after all of your answers. So even if, you solved the problem, everybody was happy at the end, they're still going to ask you, well, what could you have done differently? What would you change? So take some time to reflect on, how you can always make things better. So with these questions and all the questions that you're going to get during your interview, try to avoid those generalities when you're answering. For instance, for backbone, disagree, and commit, for that question and that answer being, well, that happens all the time. I have no problem pushing back on my executive. Or I can't think of an example, but this is what I would do. So try to think of an example ahead of time. So a better answer or more Amazonian answer for backbone, disagree, and commit could be an example of a time where you were planning a holiday party and your executive comes to you and says, hey, I want you to use this particular venue. My brother owns it. You start planning and you realize that this new venue doesn't have the same capacity as other venues that you've used in the past. So you can only invite corporate employees and you cannot invite the contractors, which this company has a lot of contractors. You've invited them year over year and they've been able to participate, and you've already started getting some feedback that it's going to impact the morale. So with disagree and commit and having a little bit of that backbone as well is presenting that to your leader and saying, hey, I'm noticing that this is going to be a capacity situation where we can't invite anyone, and providing the data and feedback about the impact on the contractors not participating. So that's the have backbone and the disagree piece. Where commit comes into is, say your executive says, no, I still want you to use that venue. Do you go back to that venue and see if maybe they can just open up tents to expand the capacity and ultimately drive that answer to a successful solution? Next, we'll talk about bias for action and delivers results, which I think these two go hand in hand when it comes to an executive assistant. Questions for bias for actions. You want to think about using your best judgment and just not being afraid to make decisions quickly. We move fast here. We don't want people that are waiting on things because you're not getting the direction. So those questions are going to sound like, tell me about a time where you had to make a critical business risk and couldn't consult with your manager. So things that have a bunch of moving parts where you're just needing to take action, and then delivers results. You think more about the final product of what you're trying to accomplish. How do you rise to the occasion when setbacks are in front of you, and how have you succeeded in your career? So questions around that can sound like, give me an example of a time when you were able to deliver on an important project under a tight deadline. And for bias for action and delivers results, you want to think of different scenarios around, complex travel, scheduling, your executives dealing with back-to-back meetings, managing projects or large events. Again, things that have a lot of moving parts that you've handled. And a lot of these things may, and details that you provide, are potentially second nature to you now, like adding in buffer times when your executive is going from meeting to meeting on campus, or looking ahead on the calendar for a large meeting coming up and blocking off time to prepare. So if you are taking those steps to set up and be proactive, we definitely want to hear about them. Next, we're going to talk about customer obsession. Everything here at Amazon starts with the customer, and we work backwards. So when answering these questions, there are a variety of customers to think about. There are those external customers, like the company's customers, who your executive is trying to pitch to. There are also other stakeholders or teams across the company that you're going to be partnering with as customers. You also have some internal customers. Your executive, of course, is one of your customers, and maybe, the executive's teams. So you want to think about times when you went above and beyond for a customer, or maybe sometimes where you've had to tell a customer no and provide an alternative solution. But with these kind of questions, you do want to make sure that you're being objective. You're not divulging any confidential information, names, and also if you are going to utilize your executive as your customer during these roles and answers, make sure you call it out just so your interviewer can process that information correctly for you. The next leadership principle we'll cover is our write a lot. And I like our write a lot, but this one I would say is probably one of the more typically confused ones. But this one's also dealing with ambiguous situations. So how you utilize your judgment, how you seek diverse ideas to test your ideas, solutions, and projects that you're working on, and how do you make sure that you are moving forward with the right decision, is where our write a lot comes in. So those kind of questions will sound like, tell me about a time where you started on a project or task and didn't know what to do next, or tell me about a time when you had to make an important decision in the absence of good data. So again, those are going to be situations that are more ambiguous, can be a little bit more complex, where you're having to use your judgment, the resources around you, but also how are you testing that information to make sure that you're moving forward with the ultimate right decision. So, a sample answer there could be something like you started a company and your third weekend, you were tasked with a space planning project. You're moving a 100-person team from one floor to the next. And actually, it was going to be a smaller space as well. So, you go on to the internet, you figure out who's the facilities team to work with. You build out the new plan based off of the floor plan provided. You order new desks that now are configured in the smaller space, but also giving people the privacy that's needed. So now you're starting to put the people into place, and you're new to this team, and so you use your judgment and research from what you overhear during meetings that you've been attending, that that Jim works pretty often with Mary on a recent project. So you put those teams together. And build everything else out around there. But how are you testing that? That is the best decision to move forward with. Are you going to Mary and saying, hey, I put you next to Jim's team because you guys have been working on this project. Is this something that you guys are constantly doing? She may say yes and validate your idea, or she may say no, I actually work with Sarah more often, so maybe our team should be closer together. And you'll make those change, and you'll have the right decision to move forward because you are getting that necessary data to make that decision. So that's where our write a lot comes in. Then next, we're going to talk about learn and be curious and ownership. When it comes to learn and be curious, you want to think about how are you learning? How are you continuing to evolve as a person in your career, in the tools that you're utilizing, and also how are you sharing that information? So how are you learning your executive and their business unit? How are you learning their customers? And by learning them, how are you using that information to be a better strategic business partner? Also, how are you learning other tools, and are you sharing those tools with your team or other executive assistants to not only make yourself more efficient, but the people around you? So a sample question there for learn and be curious can sound like, how do you stay inspired, acquire new knowledge, or innovate in your work? Or give me an example of a time when you challenged the notion that something had to be done in a certain way because it had always been done that way. And then when it comes to ownership, when it comes to this leadership principle, you want to think about, what are you taking on outside of your core EA responsibilities? Are you seeing things through fully? Somebody that doesn't make excuses when things go wrong and say, well, that wasn't my job to take care of. So some sample questions can sound like, tell me about a time when you transitioned a project to someone else, or tell me about something you took on that's significantly outside of your area of responsibilities. So there, are you seeing things through? Are you ensuring that this project is being successfully transitioned to someone else, even though it's technically out of your hands? Or are you giving them the information and resources for them also to be successful? So that covers learn and be curious and ownership. Another really important one coming up is earns trust. Probably one of the most important leadership principles at Amazon, as well as for an executive assistant. And thinking about an executive assistant, you're having to earn trust from your executives really quickly, as well as customers and other stakeholders. So you want to think about times where you are building those relationships. What are you doing to showcase that you are dependable and you can alleviate obstacles in front of you? So times when you were the hero in these situations, how you keep your commitment and adhere to having a high standard in getting things done. Being that person that listens and communicates effectively and also treats other ideas with respect and are open to feedback. Somebody that can be vocally self-critical when you're also the person that had made the mistake. So So with these questions, just as many times as we're going to ask you about when you were the hero, we're also going to ask you about when you weren't the hero, and when you weren't as great, and when you failed, or made a mistake, or received tough and critical feedback. So questions with earned trust can sound like, tell me about a time when you had to earn trust quickly, or a time when you received tough or critical feedback, or give me an example of when you made the wrong decision or failed. And I know it could be weird to potentially tell your next employer about negative things that have happened in your career, so I like to call out that there are way more right answers than there are wrong answers here. So I like to talk a little bit about some of those wrong answers. Now, one wrong answer is that I've already kind of called it out, but that you just can't be vocally self-critical. You're always pointing the fingers at everyone else. It's their fault why this didn't happen, and there could be some truth around. It could be someone else's fault where it impacted a failure for yourself. But we really want to hear about what was your part in it? What were you doing? What could you do to get ahead of something? So if you're executive, or maybe a peer didn't get you information on time and you missed the deadline, yes, technically, you could say it's their fault, but again, we want to keep it focused on you. How are you getting ahead of them? What are you putting into place to make sure that that's never going to happen to you or anyone else? Another one is that you're just not learning from your mistakes. We're starting to see it's a pattern that you're not putting things into place to make sure these mistakes aren't occurring again in the future. And during your reflect questions, what would you have done better in next time? And you could say, well, I would communicate sooner. And then in another question, I would put something into place so everyone knew, what was going on. And it starts to seem like it's a pattern that you're not putting things into place to make sure you're communicating effectively with your executive or your team members and peers. So you're not learning from your mistakes. And then the main one, and I would say last one, is just that you can't think of a mistake that is ultimately a wrong answer. You can't think of a time you made a mistake or received tough feedback, or missed a deadline, or if you're just picking a really minor one, like you forgot to add someone on to a meeting in your first job and it never happened again. The way we're looking at that is that maybe you're not earning trust by being honest, or maybe the work that you're doing just isn't that complex where you don't make any mistakes because it's at a pace or a volume that everything can be perfect. And it's, unfortunately, that's not Amazon. So we embrace what you can learn from failures and mistakes, and not to dwell on those things. It's good to reflect, see what you can do better, put something into place, and move forward. So definitely come up with some good examples around earned trust. Next, you'll also get covered during your interview loop are your functional skills, your EA functional skills. So some questions that will sound related to those functional skills are going to be around, complex travel that you've planned, events, space planning, examples around program management, keeping your executive efficient and on track when they have back-to-back meetings. Are you being proactive for them? Are you adding in buffer times and thinking about their day in that way? You'll also receive some quantifiable questions throughout your interview where they're going to be looking for a number. So don't say a lot or, gosh, too many emails. If they ask you about how many emails you receive in that day, it's always a number. So provide a number. And I always say it's good to start with a number as well with your answers by saying, this happened last week, last month, last year, in my last job. If you can't put a timestamp on it, it likely just isn't specific enough. So you want to be able to put some quantifiable data points in there. Switching over to some good to knows. Some good to knows are that your interviewers are going to be on their laptops typing the entire time that you're talking. This happens whether you're doing a virtual interview or an in-person interview. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on because I've gotten feedback that the interview can seem a little impersonal or more like a Q&A. And I always like to say that's no bearing on how you're doing. If you're walking out of that interview and not feeling like you guys are the best of friends, it's what they're doing is they are thinking of, that leadership principle question to ask you that they're assigned to assess you against. They're taking as many notes and transcribing as much of that conversation and data points as they can that you're providing them. And so some of your interviewers, they're not that great at being blind typers. They may not be great at, looking up or after you are giving an answer, they may be, typing down that last data point. So there may be, a break of silence before they ask you a follow-up question. So I just say give them a little bit of grace there because after all of your interviews, we're going to get a debrief scheduled where all of your interviewers from your interview loop is going to discuss your interview answers, the questions that were asked of you. So during that time, they're typing, they're making sure that they can articulate that well during your interview loop. And since during that debrief, we're going to be having a discussion about your answers, it's good to also vary your answers across your interviewers. You don't want us going in that interview saying like, wow, that was a really great example, but are they a one-trick pony? Is that all they have? So you want to make sure that you're varying those examples across so we can really see the depth and breadth of your experience. And I always say it's also a good idea to have your leadership principles printed out in front of you and maybe put a word next to each one with that align to different examples, events, projects that you've managed that can give you a nice refresher of an example that you'll use, as well as it paints out how many times you're going to use that example. If you have a really complex example, you're going to realize that it's going to fit into about 6 to maybe even 12 of those leadership principles. And you don't want to give one example for 12 leadership principles across those interviewers. So by writing them out and just having an idea of the different examples that you can use for those leadership principles and how often you're going to use them, you'll be able to really showcase the depth of your experience. And so from that debrief, your outcome, it can go one of 3 ways. One, we want to make you an offer. Let's do it. 2, maybe it's a great fit for Amazon. Maybe we have to switch around the team for some reason. Sometimes our roles fill, before we get to that debrief. If that's the case, I'll work really closely with you on getting you aligned with another team that aligns with what you're looking for. Sometimes I have something immediate or sometimes I have to wait for it to open, but either way, I'll work closely with you and your sourcer to make sure we're getting you aligned correctly. And then the third option is, it's not a fit. And if it's not a fit, I do have to be transparent that I can't give any, coaching reasons why or feedback from that. It kills me. It's the worst part of my job, but I like my job and those are the rules. But I like to be transparent and let you know that when I do give you a call and if it is not a fit, I do have to be brief. But either way, I will give you a call with a yes, no, or a maybe within 5 business days of that last interview is when we get that debrief scheduled. So switching over to the offers, because we're only going to think about option number one. So we want to make you an offer. So for our offers, there are a couple different components of our offers that I wanted to talk about. And so that's going to include your base salary, restricted stock units, as well as a sign-on payment that you'll receive in your initial offer letter. And restricted stock units, we'll talk a little bit about those because here at Amazon's compensation philosophy, it is really more to look at that bigger picture. We want to hire people that have that entrepreneurship mindset, as well as just our owners and literally owners of the company. So they pay you with restricted stock units as a part of your compensation. So I know some other companies, they'll give you stock as like a bonus or an extra if you're performing well or if the company's performing well. That's not necessarily the case here. Amazon gives you that base as well as restricted stock units as your compensation. So I call that out to say is that we're not super base heavy. We look at total compensation and kind of work backwards to make sure that you're getting that target number at the end of the year with those different components. We'll definitely talk more in detail about it once we get to the offer phase. But the sign-on payment portion of it, talking a little bit about that, is given to you because those restricted stock units, they're not as much vesting during year 1 and 2. So we actually give it to you as a sign-on payment over the first 2 years to help cover what's not vesting from those shares. So we just give it to you up front as if they were. But we'll talk in more detail once we get to the offer phase. I typically like to give a couple year run on what your compensation would look like here at Amazon. But we will hopefully get to those details really soon for you. Last, I wanted to talk about the Amazon Chime tool. This is the link that is going to get you to your interview loop. And I like to call some things out about your Chime link. You're going to be meeting with multiple people during your interview lineup. You do not have to move in and out of this particular Chime link if you have back-to-back interviews. If you do, your interviewers will come in and out of the room. If your interview is on multiple days or across, multiple times throughout the day, you will use the same link through your entire interview loop. So always go back to that same link that came with your interview list. Other good to know is that you should be on video during your interview loop and try to be in a very quiet area with no distractions. Is going to be really important, especially if we're doing it virtual. You still want to make sure you're getting that FaceTime with your business partners and the executives that you're going to be supporting. And some troubleshooting things that I think are important to know. Each person has a mic, and when they're talking, the mic moves. If someone has a red mic and it turns red, that means that they're having a connection issue. So if you're talking, it's sometimes good to pause to make sure that your interviewer is hearing all of the data points and details that you're providing, as well as if their mic turns red and you're talking, you want to make sure that they are capturing all of that information that you're giving them. So that is a good indicator. If you log in and your video is not working or audio, simple things like logging out and logging back in and or turning your video on and off can typically help. Same thing when it comes to buffering. Logging on and off and or going on and off video can typically help that. But you also want to make sure that you're close to a router so you have good connection as well. You also want to make sure that your computer is open to the mic for the Amazon Chime app. If you are having any issues with audio, that is typically why. I always say it's also great to download Amazon Chime not only on your laptop but on your phone or iPad as a backup option. If you need to go on video during on your computer, and sometimes dialing in through your phone is another way to make sure that they're seeing you as well as hearing you clearly throughout your interview. Well, that covers all of my interview tips and tricks for executive assistant interview loops at Amazon. If you have any changes to your run of day, feel free to reach out to us as well as your recruiting coordinator so we can make those changes. Or if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me or your sourcer. I look forward to speaking with you after your interview debrief with that yes, no, or maybe. So good luck, and we will talk again soon.